Berkeley, California was known for its university campus, a hub of intellectual thought and activism in the 1970s. In the glow of evening, the city's energy seemed electric. Streets filled with students, coffee shops buzzing with debate, each corner alive with the spirit of change. Yet on the night of February 4th, 1974, a dark chapter in the city's history would unfold. Inside a modest apartment near campus, Patricia Campbell Hurst, known to most as Patty, was settling in with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. Patty was only 19, slender with a girlish face framed by soft dark hair. To the world, she was a privileged young woman, heiress to the vast Hearst fortune, granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst. But to Patty, she was just another college student, caught between classes in the excitement of young love. Little did she know that this night would alter her life in ways unimaginable, spiraling her into a vortex of crime and notoriety. The clock struck 9:17 p.m. when a loud, violent knock rattled the apartment door. Before Stephen or Patty could react, the door crashed open. In a heartbeat, masked figures filled the room, guns pointed, voices sharp and filled with threat. "Get on the floor! Hands behind your head!" one of the assailants barked, a voice cold and devoid of mercy. Stephen stammered, "Please, who are you? What do you want?" But he barely had time to process what was happening before a heavy hand struck him to the ground. The intruders kicked him repeatedly, each blow filled with a furious intent. Patty watched in horror, too terrified to scream, as her fiancé's body crumpled on the floor. Another masked figure seized Patty by the arm, her vision blurred, the grip on her arm bruising her skin as she was pulled from the room. Just like that, her life as Patty Hurst, the heiress, the student, the beloved, shattered in the space of a few minutes. Patty's abductors were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a radical left-wing group with an unusual mix of motives. Founded by Donald DeFreeze, an ex-convict and self-styled revolutionary leader, the SLA was as much a mystery as a menace. Its members, a ragtag collection of political radicals, former inmates, and disillusioned activists, followed DeFreeze's call to arms with fervor. Their goal, they claimed, was to liberate America from capitalism and oppression, though their methods and ideology seemed often as chaotic as they were violent. Inside the van where Patty was thrown, she was blindfolded, hands bound, her body trembling with the chill of fear. She could hear DeFreeze's deep, resonant voice muttering instructions, his tone calm and almost detached. She sensed the presence of others around her, silent figures who seemed to hang on DeFreeze's every word. One voice cut through the silence. "What do we do with her now?" It was the voice of Willie Wolf, one of the SLA's most ardent members. To the group, Wolf was known as Kajo, and he had a reputation for his fierce loyalty to DeFreeze. Wolf's words hung in the air, his uncertainty revealing a hint of tension among the group. DeFreeze, or Cinque, as he preferred to be called, exhaled slowly. "She's going to be useful," he replied, with a chilling certainty that left no room for argument. "She'll be our message to the Hearst family and to America. The revolution needs sacrifices." The group fell silent, each member weighing the implications of Cinque's words. They were radicals, yes, but not all were ready for the full extent of what DeFreeze envisioned. Yet none dared challenge him, least of all in front of their new captive. The Symbionese Liberation Army had been looking for a high-profile figure to capture the public's attention. To them, Patty Hurst was the perfect choice, a symbol of the capitalist elite they loathed. With her father, Randolph Hearst, overseeing a publishing empire, Patty was, in their eyes, both a valuable pawn and a powerful message. By taking her, they would force the Hearst family to bow to their demands, proving that the powerful could be brought to their knees. Inside the small room where Patty was eventually brought, her blindfold was removed, and she found herself staring into the faces of her captors. The walls around her were bare, a solitary light bulb flickered above, casting ominous shadows across the room. DeFreeze stepped forward, his eyes hard, assessing her with a look of both disdain and curiosity. "Do you understand why you're here, Patty?" he asked, voice low but steady. She shook her head, too stunned to form words. "You represent everything we're fighting against," he continued, his tone laced with contempt. "Privilege, power, wealth, all the things that keep people oppressed. But you You're going to help us change that. You'll be our symbol. One of the other captors, Nancy Ling Perry, Fahiza, as she was known within the SLA, watched Patty with an almost predatory gaze. For Nancy, this kidnapping was a way to redefine her life, a dramatic break from her past as a former cheerleader turned radical. In Patty, she saw an opportunity for transformation, both for their cause and perhaps even herself. The first night of captivity stretched into days, with Patty held in darkness, isolated and under constant watch. Soon she was forced to record a message for her family, who by then had mobilized every resource in an attempt to find her. The voice that emerged from the tape was distant, detached, almost foreign. "Mom, Dad, they have me," she began, her voice breaking. "I don't know where I am, but they say they'll let me go if you meet their demands. Please, just do what they ask." The demands were extraordinary. DeFreeze and the SLA called for the Hurst family to donate $2 million in food to the needy across California, with plans for a second donation of equal size if the SLA deemed it necessary. Randolph Hearst was left reeling. He was a wealthy man, yes, but he understood the limits of his influence in this dark new world. He knew his daughter's life hung in the balance, and that any delay could mean disaster. For days, the media exploded with reports on Patty's kidnapping. Newsstands bore her face, the beautiful young woman staring back from a life interrupted, now caught up in an ideological struggle beyond her understanding. The SLA tapes were broadcast nationwide, and soon Patty's voice became a haunting reminder of the unknown fate awaiting her. As the SLA's deadline approached, Randolph Hearst arranged for a massive food giveaway in Oakland. The event was chaotic. Thousands showed up, eager for free food, but the scramble led to confusion, near riots, and a public relations nightmare. Meanwhile, there was still no word on Patty's release, and as days passed, hope dimmed. Inside her cell, Patty felt the weight of uncertainty bearing down on her. DeFreeze and his followers had made their intentions clear, yet their methods and motives remained shrouded in shadow. She was their prisoner, yes, but what they ultimately wanted from her was still unclear. The hours stretched into days, each one filled with whispered threats, and the flickering shadow of revolution became her new reality. Unbeknownst to the public, Patty was slowly being drawn into a twisted world where loyalty, fear, and ideology collided, with no easy escape in sight. Her transformation had only just begun. The passing days blurred into an endless cycle of fear, hunger, and fatigue for Patty Hurst. Locked away in her cramped cell, she lost track of time, barely able to recall whether it was morning or night. The flickering light in the basement room cast distorted shadows on the walls, and the faces of her captors were ever present, each one etched into her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. But it was their leader, Donald DeFreeze, Chinke, who haunted her thoughts the most. Chinke's influence was pervasive, his presence casting a palpable weight over the SLA. Tall and intense, with piercing eyes that could shift from cold calculation to fiery zeal in an instant, he exuded a strange charisma. The son of a housekeeper and a factory worker, DeFreeze had spent years in and out of prison, where he cultivated his revolutionary ideology. He envisioned the SLA as an army of liberation, seeking to destroy the pillars of the establishment that he believed oppressed society's most vulnerable. But this vision was tangled in his personal grudges, mixed with bitterness and rage. One night as he entered Patty's cell, DeFreeze's gaze lingered on her. "You're quiet," he said, his voice measured but unyielding. "But that's not going to help you. Not here." Patty swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" DeFreeze crouched beside her, his eyes searching her face. "I want you to see," he said softly, though there was nothing kind in his tone. "I want you to understand the world beyond your walls. You've been sheltered your whole life. You're going to be part of something bigger than yourself now." She averted her gaze, but he tilted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're going to become a symbol, Patty, and symbols," he paused, a glint of steel in his gaze, "are far more powerful than people." As the days turned into weeks, Patty found herself submerged in the twisted ideology of the SLA. Her captors subjected her to an unrelenting series of lectures on their beliefs, demanding she understand their cause, their struggles, their rage. DeFreeze led the sessions, his voice resonant, spinning tales of inequality, state violence, and repression. His rhetoric was laced with phrases that were foreign to Patty's world, but she soon learned to listen, to absorb what was being said. Fear made her compliant, and the unbroken captivity dulled her resistance, leaving her vulnerable to their influence. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible, Patty?" DeFreeze would ask, his eyes flashing with anger as he paced. "To grow up knowing the system was built to keep people like me down?" Beside him sat Nancy Ling Perry, Fahiza, who watched Patty with a hard gaze. Perry, once a bright high school cheerleader with dreams of success, had taken a dark turn into radical activism. To Patty, she seemed distant, her eyes filled with intensity. Perry's loyalty to the cause was unwavering, but every now and then a hint of doubt flashed across her face, as if she questioned how far they'd fallen from the principles that once guided them. Wolf, or Kajo, was a different presence altogether. He was the intellectual of the group, the one who spoke passionately of class struggle and revolution. He would sit by Patty and, with almost gentle fervor, recount his vision of a world liberated from the greed of men like her grandfather. He spoke of the revolution with an air of near religious devotion, as if the SLA were his salvation. "Patty, you can't keep hiding from the truth," Wolf whispered to her one night, his voice almost tender. "We're all caught in this web of lies and exploitation. But you're in a position to change things. You have power in ways that most people can only dream of." She looked away, wondering if anything he said held an ounce of truth. But each day the group pressed harder, pulling her into their warped reality. Her days were filled with their voices, their anger, and their relentless, unyielding ideology. She was no longer Patty Hurst, granddaughter of a media titan. She was a prisoner of a revolution she barely understood, a pawn in a game she couldn't escape. The turning point came in the form of isolation, days upon days spent in the darkness, separated from any shred of comfort. The SLA members took turns keeping watch over her, their gazes cold and unforgiving. Her captors stopped speaking to her directly, barely acknowledging her presence, as though she were a ghost among them. She was fed sparingly, forced to sit for hours in silence, her wrists and ankles sore from the constraints. She began to lose track of time altogether, her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. The isolation began to work on her psyche. She found herself questioning everything she knew, her memories slipping into a fog. Was her family even looking for her? Did they care? Did she have any hope of escape? One night, Wolf entered her cell with a small flashlight. He sat across from her, his face solemn, as if sharing in her despair. "Patty," he murmured, his voice softened, "we can get you out of here, but you have to trust us." "Trust you?" Her voice cracked, the words spilling out as she struggled to hold onto her sanity. "You kidnapped me. We're not your enemies," he interrupted, a hint of sorrow in his voice. "We're trying to save you. From your life, from the lies you were born into." The words, strange and haunting, hung in the air between them. She felt a flicker of doubt, as if the life she'd known was slipping further and further away. And she realized with a shiver that it was exactly what they wanted. The first tangible sign of her captor's influence became evident in the recordings Patty made, each one laced with carefully scripted rhetoric. At first, she recited their words through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with rage and frustration. But with each passing tape, her voice grew steady, and her anger seemed to fade, replaced by a dull resignation. The nation listened, transfixed as Patty's words echoed across the airwaves. To the world, she seemed to be transforming, her messages filled with radical declarations and strange new ideals. Public opinion swayed wildly. Some argued she had been brainwashed. Others believed she was a willing participant, a spoiled girl playing revolutionary. Her parents, frantic and overwhelmed by the media circus, clung to hope that this was all a result of coercion. But even they began to wonder, was Patty still the daughter they knew? Back in her cell, Patty found herself succumbing to the endless drumbeat of her captors' voices, her reality splintering. Her memories of home grew faint, while her days with the SLA became sharper, clearer, more real. The group began to treat her differently, no longer a mere hostage, but as someone on the brink of joining them. One night, DeFries gathered the group in a circle, Patty seated among them. The dim light in the room flickered, casting long shadows over their faces, highlighting their hardened expressions and unwavering loyalty to their leader. "It's time to make a statement," DeFries announced, his gaze sweeping over them all, landing on Patty with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. "The revolution needs to show its power, and we need all hands." He didn't explain further, but the glint in his eye left no doubt. He had a plan, and Patty was to play a role in it. The room fell silent, each person weighed by the enormity of his words. Patty could feel the weight of their gazes on her, a silent test of her loyalty, an unspoken demand. She felt the familiar surge of fear, but this time something else stirred, an emptiness, a resignation that had settled deep within her. A quiet nod escaped her, almost imperceptible, and as she did, she knew there would be no turning back. Little did the world know that, soon Patty Hurst would be at the center of one of the most shocking acts of rebellion the nation had ever seen. In the early hours of April 15th, 1974, the Symbionese Liberation Army assembled in a cramped apartment in San Francisco, reviewing every detail of their audacious plan. The bank job they envisioned wasn't just another heist, it was a declaration, a message delivered to America at gunpoint. Patty, now going by the name Tania, a moniker she'd adopted as a symbol of her supposed solidarity with the SLA, stood in the dim room, her face a mask of dread. Somewhere in the haze of captivity, her terror had blurred into a strange numbness, her former life feeling like a distant memory. The SLA wanted a target that would make headlines and create fear, striking directly at what they saw as the corrupt heart of American capitalism. Hibernia Bank, a solid, prominent institution in San Francisco, was chosen for its visibility and symbolism. If they succeeded, their demands for revolution would be heard across the country. DeFries had orchestrated every aspect of the plan. His voice cut through the tension like a knife as he reviewed the final details with his team, pacing back and forth. Patty's role, he informed her, was non-negotiable. "You're going in with us, Tania," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, unyielding. "We need the people to see what they don't expect, that someone like you can see the truth, can join us in our fight." He stepped closer, voice lowering to a chilling whisper. "You're one of us now." The team moved in silence through the quiet streets, slipping through the early morning shadows. They'd rehearsed this moment countless times in cramped rooms, until every motion, every step was second nature. Clad in trench coats and carrying weapons, they approached the bank as it opened. Patty was part of this surreal march, barely able to comprehend the reality of what she was about to do. As the group entered, DeFries took the lead, his voice booming in the lobby. "This is a holdup," he shouted, gun raised high. The patrons and employees froze, shock flashing across their faces as they registered the menacing sight of the masked figures before them. Screams erupted, and chaos unfolded within seconds. Patty, caught up in the adrenaline-fueled haze, found herself in front of the bank cameras. Her own weapon felt alien in her hands, but as she looked at the terrified customers around her, something seemed to shift. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw down the gun and flee, but the iron gaze of her captors rooted her in place. In her mind, she could almost hear DeFries' words echoing, demanding obedience, loyalty. "Get down," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm, adopting the role she'd been given. And as the patrons dropped to the ground, their fearful glances meeting hers, she felt a bizarre sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from afar. Back at home, the nation watched in disbelief as security footage of the heist flooded the news. Grainy black and white images of Patty Hurst, the missing heiress, standing in the bank with a weapon, her face set with grim determination, looped endlessly on screens across the country. For weeks, her family and friends had held on to hope, believing she would be returned to them, rescued from her captors. But now they saw a different story unfolding. The footage ignited a firestorm of controversy. To some, Patty was a victim, clearly coerced into action by the SLA. To others, she was a traitor, a symbol of wealth corrupted by radical ideology. For the authorities, the footage served as a damning piece of evidence, enough to make her a wanted fugitive. Reporters flooded her family's estate, demanding answers. But even they seemed unsure what to make of it all. Was Patty truly brainwashed, or had she willingly joined the SLA's violent mission? In the Hurst family's home, the shock was unbearable. Randolph and Catherine Hurst, her parents, were thrust into a world they barely recognized, confronted with images of their daughter transformed into a figure of infamy. Their grief was compounded by the media frenzy that painted Patty as either a victim or a willing revolutionary, an image they could hardly reconcile with the bright, spirited girl they'd raised. Their desperation became public as they made emotional appeals, pleading with both the SLA and with Patty herself, urging her to come back to them. But beneath their grief lay the gnawing fear that perhaps she was lost to them forever. Stephen Weed, her former fiancé, was equally haunted by the footage. Once her closest confidant, he now faced a void he couldn't bridge. The Patty he knew seemed unrecognizable, obscured by the mask of Tania. Was she really a victim of the SLA's indoctrination, or was there something about her that had been drawn to their cause? After the heist, the SLA went underground, hiding in safe houses and barely escaping the law's reach. The group grew increasingly paranoid, the walls of their hideouts closing in as they felt the tightening noose of law enforcement around them. As they moved from place to place, Patty was left with little time to process her actions or question her beliefs. Any sign of hesitation or weakness was quickly squashed by DeFries and his followers. They reminded her, day in and day out, that her previous life was a lie, that the people who'd raised her were part of the system that kept the poor and marginalized oppressed. In their view, her new family, the SLA, was the only truth she needed. In quiet moments, though, Patty's mind would drift back to her old life, her family, the future she once imagined. But those thoughts were fleeting, soon drowned out by the relentless conditioning that had become her reality. One night, Wolf sat down next to her, his gaze filled with a strange kind of gentleness. "It's hard to let go, isn't it?" he asked softly. "To leave behind everything you knew. But the truth is, the life you had, none of that was real." She didn't respond, too numb to engage in another ideological exchange. Yet his words struck a nerve, and she found herself questioning whether anything in her life had ever truly belonged to her. She was Patty Hurst, yet she wasn't. She was Tania, yet she wasn't. By May, the SLA was cornered. A series of missteps and botched plans led law enforcement to one of their hideouts in Los Angeles. As police closed in, tensions within the group reached a boiling point. They were a small, embattled army, and their leader was willing to go to extremes to prove their cause was worth dying for. Patty watched in horror as DeFries and the others prepared for what seemed like a last stand. The police had surrounded their location, and a tense standoff ensued, culminating in a violent shootout. DeFries, Perry, and several others fell in a hail of bullets as the building erupted in flames. When the smoke cleared, the SLA's leadership was left in ruins. Patty was not present during the raid, as she had been stationed at another location, but the loss of her comrades shook her deeply. She was now a fugitive, hunted by the FBI, with a bounty on her head and no place to turn. The survivors of the SLA went into hiding, including Patty. The images of the charred remains of her comrades haunted her thoughts. She was still alive, but her captors were dead or imprisoned, and yet she felt bound to them. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, she questioned whether she even wanted freedom anymore. She had been forged into something new, but she couldn't quite tell if it was strength or simply despair that kept her going. Life on the run became her new reality. Each day, a series of close calls and tense moments, where they moved from one hideout to another, just barely evading the authorities. The fugitive lifestyle wore on her psyche, blending the lines between who she was, who she had been, and who she was becoming. Patty was no longer the young woman she'd been at Berkeley. She was Tania, a fugitive, a ghost of the girl who'd been taken that February night. And as she stared out from yet another hideout, she felt the hollowness creeping in, a sense of identity slipping away, replaced by the chilling understanding that she could never go back to the world she'd once known. Months on the run with the remaining members of the SLA took a toll on Patty Hurst. By now, her world had contracted to a series of safe houses, cramped rooms with drawn blinds, and late-night strategy sessions that never seemed to end. The adrenaline that once sustained her faded, replaced by an exhausted emptiness that she couldn't shake. The constant fear of capture became her only reality, while the memory of her previous life grew fainter. She still occasionally thought of her family, of her mother's warm embrace and the comforts of home. But those memories, once a lifeline, had transformed into ghosts that haunted her rather than offering any solace. She knew her family still cared, but how could they ever accept her now, after everything she'd done? The remaining SLA members were few but deeply committed. Bill and Emily Heiress, among the most devoted, were determined to continue the fight, each day becoming more reckless and paranoid. Their unwavering loyalty to the cause became Patty's anchor, even as she questioned her own place in it. She could see the strain in their eyes, the fear they hid behind harsh words and bravado. One night, Patty voiced her fears to Emily in a rare moment of vulnerability. "What are we really doing here?" she asked quietly, not meeting Emily's gaze. "Does any of this even make sense anymore?" Emily looked at her sharply, her expression hard. "This is war, Tania. War isn't pretty or easy. We're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. You should understand that by now." Patty nodded, the weight of the words pressing down on her. But even as she forced herself to believe it, a lingering doubt gnawed at her from the inside. How much of her commitment was born out of true belief, and how much was survival? As the SLA's numbers dwindled, Patty found herself more deeply enmeshed in the group's activities. She was no longer a hostage or even just a member. She had become a full participant, a comrade known as Tania, a name that seemed to erase everything she'd once been. The transformation wasn't just a matter of name, though. It was a shift in identity. Tania, her new self, became a shield against the uncertainty that plagued her mind. But her actions grew darker with each passing week. Patty, as Tania, joined the SLA in robbing stores and engaging in small skirmishes with police, leaving her indelibly marked as a criminal in the eyes of the public and the law. One particular incident stands out as emblematic of her descent. On May 16, 1974, Patty was involved in the robbery of Mel's Sporting Goods in Los Angeles. During the robbery, Bill Heiress was nearly apprehended, and in the chaos that ensued, Patty fired her weapon into the air, helping to create a diversion that allowed the group to escape. This incident, caught in the security footage, circulated widely in the media. The grainy footage of Patty, young, tense, and holding a gun, was unlike any image of her the public had ever seen. For her family, it was yet another blow, another confirmation that the Patty they knew was slipping further away. Meanwhile, the debate over Patty's motivations grew louder. The media portrayed her as everything from a brainwashed victim to a willing participant, fueling public fascination with the enigmatic young woman who had once graced high society gatherings and magazine covers. After the Mel's Sporting Goods incident, Patty and the remaining SLA members intensified their efforts to evade capture, living as ghosts, moving from one rundown hideout to another, unable to stay in any one place for long. Their paranoia reached a fever pitch as the FBI closed in on them, each narrow escape adding to the growing sense of desperation that haunted their every move. Their world shrank to the four walls of whatever hideout they found, usually dingy apartments in anonymous neighborhoods where they blended into the city's vast, faceless crowds. Patty grew accustomed to the suffocating routines, the constant discussions of revolutionary rhetoric mixed with fear of betrayal. To the outside world, they had vanished, but the pressure only increased. Every knock at the door, every passing police siren became a trigger for panic, and Patty found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, haunted by the knowledge that it was only a matter of time before they were found. During these endless days of hiding, Patty's mind began to play tricks on her. She questioned her own choices, her beliefs, even her identity. She was a fugitive, wanted for crimes that would once have been inconceivable to her. She found herself imagining her family watching the news, wondering what they would think, whether they still saw her as their daughter or as a stranger. But for every flicker of doubt, the SLA found ways to draw her back in, reinforcing her commitment to the cause with stories of injustice and tales of oppression. They made her believe that she had crossed a line and that the only way forward was to continue the path they'd set her on. On September 18, 1975, after nearly 19 months on the run, the law finally caught up with Patty Hurst. She was arrested in a San Francisco apartment alongside Wendy Yoshimura, an associate and former sympathizer of the SLA, after the FBI received a tip-off. The arrest was swift, ending in moments that seemed almost anticlimactic after the relentless pursuit that had spanned 2 years. The images of her capture were stark. Patty, clad in a simple sweatshirt and jeans, her face expressionless as she was led away in handcuffs. To the public, she appeared hollow, as if the young woman they remembered had vanished entirely. Her once vibrant personality was gone, replaced by the weary resignation of someone who had lived through hell. When they brought her into custody, she was defiant. "I don't regret anything," she said, her voice steely, though her eyes betrayed a haunted quality. But as the days wore on, that defiance gave way to exhaustion, as though the weight of everything she had endured, every lie she'd been fed, finally came crashing down. The trial of Patty Hurst became one of the most sensational legal battles of the era, and her story captivated the nation as much as it baffled them. The prosecution painted her as a willing participant, a wealthy socialite turned violent revolutionary. The defense argued that she had been brainwashed, subjected to psychological manipulation and physical threats that had left her with no choice but to comply. Dr. Margaret Singer, a prominent psychologist who studied brainwashing techniques, testified that Patty had likely suffered from coercive persuasion, a mental conditioning that left her unable to act of her own free will. Her trauma, her isolation, and the relentless indoctrination had taken their toll, leaving her a shell of her former self. But the jury was skeptical. To many, Patty's actions seemed too deliberate, too committed. How could they reconcile the image of the gun-wielding revolutionary with the narrative of a young woman coerced and traumatized? In March 1976, she was found guilty of armed robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Yet even as she began serving her sentence, the public remained divided. Some saw her as a victim of a twisted ideology, a young woman who had been stolen from her family and remade into a figure she could barely recognize. Others believed she was complicit, a participant who had embraced the SLA's cause of her own accord. In 1979, after serving nearly 2 years in prison, Patty Hurst received a commutation from President Jimmy Carter, reducing her sentence to time served. Years later, President Bill Clinton would grant her a full pardon, erasing her criminal record and symbolizing a degree of redemption. But Patty's story was far from over. She returned to her family, attempting to rebuild her life and confront the painful legacy left by her time with the SLA. Her experiences remained shrouded in mystery, and the public's fascination with her story never waned. In the years that followed, she would speak out, recounting her trauma, her captivity, and the profound psychological toll that her ordeal had inflicted upon her. She described the SLA as a nightmare, a world of coercion and fear that had consumed her and left her a shadow of who she once was. For Patty Hurst, life after the SLA became a journey of reclaiming her identity, of confronting the ghosts of her past, and piecing together a fractured existence. She would never fully escape the legacy of Tania or the blurred lines between victimhood and complicity that had defined her story. Yet through it all, she remained a complex figure whose life story defied simple explanations. Hers was a tale of survival, of resilience in the face of unthinkable circumstances, and of a young woman's search for herself in a world that had stolen her innocence and left her to piece together her shattered reality. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the halls, cameras flashed, and the public watched with bated breath as the trial of Patricia Hurst, once the darling of high society, began. Her story had already captivated the nation. A privileged heiress turned bank robber, a young woman who had become a symbol of the disturbing intersection between wealth, radicalism, and psychological manipulation. Now it was time for her to stand trial. From the outset, the case presented unprecedented challenges. On one side, the prosecution argued that Patty was a willing participant in the SLA's crimes, an insider who had fully embraced their violent cause. On the other, the defense claimed that she had been brutally brainwashed, forced to join the SLA under the threat of death, and held as their prisoner for over a year. At the heart of it all lay the question of Patty's mental state, a mystery as enigmatic as her transformation into Tania. For the prosecution, Patty Hurst's behavior during and after the Hibernia Bank robbery was damning. They pointed to the surveillance footage showing her holding an assault rifle, shouting commands, and seeming every bit the revolutionary. She had undergone weapons training, carried out bank robberies, and even fired shots at police officers during a tense standoff. Her public statements to the media further muddied the waters. Recordings of her passionately defending the SLA's ideology and disowning her family were played before the court, leaving a lasting impression. The defendant chose this life, the prosecutor argued in his opening statement. This was not the behavior of a woman held captive. Patricia Hurst could have escaped countless times, but instead she chose to commit violent acts alongside the SLA. However, the defense, led by attorney F. Lee Bailey, painted a starkly different picture. They argued that Patty had been subjected to a calculated campaign of terror, psychological manipulation, and threats designed to make her compliance inevitable. She had endured solitary confinement, harsh indoctrination, and physical abuse at the hands of the SLA, they claimed. These tactics, according to Bailey, had altered her very psyche, leaving her powerless to resist. To bolster their case, the defense called upon Dr. Margaret Singer, a respected psychologist who specialized in coercive persuasion and brainwashing. She testified that Patty exhibited classic signs of Stockholm Syndrome, a condition where captives develop sympathy, loyalty, or even devotion to their captors. Patty Hurst was subjected to extreme mental and emotional torture, Dr. Singer stated before a captivated jury. In such conditions, her sense of reality would have been entirely distorted, making her actions less a matter of choice and more a result of survival. The jury listened intently as experts explained how trauma could fundamentally change a person's behavior, even forcing them to identify with those who had caused them harm. And yet the prosecution pushed back, questioning how far brainwashing could truly explain her actions. Could Patty's transformation into Tania be a calculated facade? Or was it the tragic consequence of prolonged psychological manipulation? As the trial continued, Patty took the stand, providing testimony that stunned the courtroom. She recounted the terrifying moments of her initial abduction, the blindfold, the threats, the disorienting nights in the SLA's closet. Her words brought the horrors of her captivity to life, painting a picture of fear and desperation that left an indelible mark on everyone present. "They told me they'd kill me if I didn't do exactly as they said," Patty stated, her voice barely a whisper as she recounted the threats she faced. She described the unyielding control DeFreeze and others wielded over her, the constant reminders that any misstep could mean her death, and the emotional manipulation that gradually broke down her resistance. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor challenged her, presenting the surveillance footage as irrefutable evidence of her willingness. "Miss Hurst," he asked, "in that moment when you shouted commands at innocent people, when you held that rifle, what stopped you from saying no? Why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you escape?" Her response was chilling. "There was nowhere to go. They had made it clear. I was one of them now, whether I liked it or not." This brief exchange left a haunting question in the air. Had Patty truly believed she had no choice? Or was this yet another carefully crafted argument? The trial didn't just take place in the courtroom. It was a public spectacle, broadcast across the nation, fueling debate over Patty's culpability and the sinister influence of groups like the SLA. Media outlets eagerly pounced on every detail, making it a cultural phenomenon. Tabloids ran wild with headlines about the captive heiress turned radical, questioning her motives and dissecting her every move. Public opinion was polarized. Some saw Patty as a victim, a symbol of innocence corrupted by a toxic ideology. Others viewed her as a willing participant who had betrayed her family and the American dream. Talk shows and editorials debated whether she was a villain or a victim, adding fuel to an already blazing fire. Patty's family, meanwhile, watched the proceedings with a sense of despair. Her father, Randolph Hurst, was a fixture at the courthouse, his face etched with a mixture of determination and heartbreak. The Hurst family, once synonymous with wealth and privilege, had been dragged into a dark world they could never have foreseen. After weeks of testimony, deliberations, and public scrutiny, the jury reached a decision that would divide the nation. Patty Hurst was found guilty of armed robbery and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Though her defense team appealed the ruling, the weight of the verdict was undeniable. The judge's final remarks resonated through the courtroom. He acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case but remained firm, stating that Patty's participation in the bank robbery had been too calculated to excuse entirely. Despite her possible mental manipulation, her actions had crossed a line that, in his view, could not go unpunished. The reaction was immediate and intense. Supporters of Patty's defense were outraged, viewing the decision as a grave injustice against a young woman who had been forced into an unimaginable situation. Meanwhile, others hailed the verdict as a victory for accountability, a reminder that no one, not even a Hearst, was above the law. For nearly 2 years, Patty Hurst served her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. Inside the prison walls, she lived a vastly different life, far removed from both her former world of wealth and her time as a fugitive. The experience forced her to confront her past in a new way, revisiting the trauma she had endured while grappling with the consequences of her actions. During her time in prison, her mental health improved with the help of therapy and support from family and friends. She received visits from her parents who remained steadfast in their belief that Patty had been a victim, not a criminal. In their eyes, she was still the daughter they'd raised, and they fought tirelessly to secure her release. Public sentiment toward Patty began to shift. Her case became a focal point in debates on brainwashing, trauma, and rehabilitation. The Hearst lobbied for a commutation of her sentence, appealing to high-profile politicians, journalists, and activists who had grown sympathetic to her plight. Finally, in 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, reducing it to time served. When she was released, Patty emerged from prison a changed woman. Though she had been granted freedom, she would never truly escape the shadow of her time with the SLA. Her name remained indelibly linked to a complex, painful story that defied simple explanations. In the years following her release, Patty sought a life of quiet obscurity, striving to rebuild herself away from the public eye. She married Bernard Shaw, her former bodyguard, and together they started a family. The process of healing was slow and unsteady, marked by attempts to reclaim her identity, to distance herself from the stigma that followed her. In 2001, Patty was granted a full pardon by President Bill Clinton, a final chapter in her legal battles and a symbolic acknowledgement of her unique ordeal. This act helped soften her public image, allowing her to live with a sense of closure. Patty eventually told her story in her own words, publishing a memoir that offered a glimpse into her harrowing experience and the complex psychological scars it left. She described her years with the SLA as a twisted nightmare and spoke openly about the effects of trauma and indoctrination, shedding light on the unseen forces that had once shaped her actions. To this day, her story continues to resonate, a tale of wealth, tragedy, captivity, and survival. It raises questions that have yet to be fully answered. How far can trauma push a person? At what point does survival become complicity? And what does it mean to be truly free? Patty Hurst's story remains an enduring reminder of the complexities of human psychology, the influence of power and fear, and the fine line between victim and perpetrator. Her journey from captive to criminal to survivor is a narrative that captivates, perplexes, and haunts. A legacy that defies any simple resolution, but offers a profound look into one of the darkest and most enigmatic chapters of American history. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked among neatly trimmed lawns and calm streets, lives a woman whose name once echoed across the nation. Patty Hurst, now a mother and a grandmother, she's found a way to build a life in the shadow of a haunting past. Behind her calm gaze lies a story dissected and debated for decades. Yet the truth of her experience remains an enigma, locked away in a place only she can reach. There was a time when Patty Hurst was synonymous with the complexities of the human psyche, the extreme reaches of ideological fanaticism, and the devastating power of trauma. She was an heiress turned hostage, swept into a life no one could have predicted, a life that transformed her from a young woman of privilege into an unexpected revolutionary. This story embedded itself in America's memory, a tale of privilege colliding with peril, a life warped by survival, and a cautionary mystery that has fascinated millions. Years after her release, the questions linger, challenging our sense of certainty. What would any of us do in her place? How deeply could survival or loyalty twist our moral compass? Patty Hurst's story forces us to confront that hazy line between victim and perpetrator, one much finer than we'd like to believe. The Symbionese Liberation Army, the group that pulled Patty into their violent ideology, dissolved shortly after her capture. Its leaders faded away, but their story remains as a chilling reminder of the 1970s, a time when the line between peace and chaos was paper-thin. Today, Patty lives a quieter life, perhaps seeking the peace that eluded her for so long. Yet no documentary can capture the depth of her experience, the reality of being Tania, of facing her family, her captors, and, ultimately, herself. As the credits roll, viewers are left with the echoes of a story that refuses to be boxed into a single narrative. It's a tale of innocence lost, of resilience, and of a question that will forever haunt America. What would you have done in her place? After Patty Hurst was arrested in September 1975, her life took a dramatic turn. No longer the enigmatic figure known as Tania, she now faced the reality of a high-profile trial and public scrutiny. The FBI had tracked her down to an apartment in San Francisco, where she was hiding with SLA members Wendy Yoshimura and Bill and Emily Heiress. When authorities raided the apartment, Hurst reportedly declared, "I surrender," and quietly submitted to arrest. Photos of her handcuffed and disheveled quickly circulated, shocking the public who had come to see her as a strange combination of victim and perpetrator. Patty was initially held in a federal prison in Dublin, California, where her behavior fluctuated between compliant and distressed, often showing signs of severe emotional strain. Her defense team, led by renowned attorney F. Lee Bailey, began preparing an argument based on the psychological trauma and alleged brainwashing she had suffered during her captivity. Psychologists and psychiatrists were brought in to examine her mental state, many concluding that she exhibited signs of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological condition where captives develop a bond with their captors. According to Patty's account, she had endured repeated threats, physical abuse, and intense psychological manipulation during her time with the SLA, all of which contributed to her transformation from a kidnapped heiress into a militant supporter of their cause. The trial began in 1976, capturing national attention. Patty's defense painted her as a victim of radical coercion, but the prosecution countered with the footage from the infamous Hibernia Bank robbery and her public statements in support of the SLA. The prosecution argued that Hurst was a willing participant, even noting how she had wielded a rifle and shouted commands during the heist. Despite her defense team's compelling case, the jury convicted her of armed robbery, and she was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The sentence shocked many of her supporters, who had believed that her time as a victim would be taken into greater account. After serving 22 months, Patty's sentence was commuted by President Jimmy Carter in 1979, following extensive lobbying by her family and mounting public support. Though not a complete pardon, the commutation reduced her sentence to time served, and she was released from prison. Hurst's return to civilian life was marked by an attempt to escape the spotlight and live as quietly as possible. In 1982, she married Bernard Shaw, a former police officer assigned to her security detail during her appeal. The couple went on to have 2 daughters, and Patty gradually began to reestablish herself away from the public eye. Years later, in 2001, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon, which officially expunged her criminal record. Hurst's later years saw her step into the public sphere again, albeit on her own terms. She appeared in several television shows, wrote a memoir detailing her captivity, and worked to clarify the depth of her trauma and manipulation. Today, Hurst remains a figure of public intrigue, symbolizing both the power of human resilience and the dark complexities of a period in American history defined by countercultural extremism and violence.